This first session is basically an introduction to research integrity in the sense that it's going to help us to understand a little bit more what research integrity involves and precisely a few things around practices that are not acceptable in research and practices that can actually constitute research misconduct. Let me just make sure that I started this. Yeah. So, my name is Catherine Dean. I'm the Research Ethics and Integrity Officer at the university, and I'm based with the Research Development and Support team in the Office of the Vice President for Research. And I'm available for any queries, consultations, etc., around matters to do with research integrity and also research ethics. Okay, so the first thing that I was going to do is to show you this brief video about researcher responsibility, just because it helps to sort of get a sense of the fact that as researchers, well, we are responsible for what we do. And that responsibility is not just to ourselves, so to speak, but also to the broader society. Sorry, I'm just setting this up so that I can ensure that the sound will also be shared. So we'll just have a quick look at this video to get us started.
Researchers are generally driven by curiosity and enthusiasm for their field of study. They may want to discover more about human behavior, reconstruct the history of the Earth, develop new technologies, or appreciate how works of art were created. Whatever their field of research, researchers do not operate in a vacuum. They are trained by other researchers, use the methods and tools of their field of research, and have their work judged by colleagues. Research institutions generally manage research funding and help researchers comply with rules and regulations. Researchers also work for the public, which often funds their work. The public relies on researchers' discoveries to solve problems, develop new technologies, and inform decision-making. For this system to work properly, researchers must live up to the duties and obligations that their peers, their institution, and the public expect them to embrace.
Okay, so we'll stop that there and I'll go back to my slides. So that was basically just to give us a chance to think a little bit about our responsibilities as researchers and the fact that we're not working only for ourselves, but also for the broader society. So a phrase that has become popular these days is the expression good research conduct. So what do we mean by that term, good research conduct? Basically, that phrase captures the duties and obligations that as researchers we're expected to fulfill and respect, let's say, when we are carrying out researchers. So when we're carrying out research. So if a researcher is genuinely committed to upholding standards of good research conduct, then we can say they're acting with research integrity. So the good research conduct is linked to research integrity. And ideally, research integrity is something which we could consider as a design approach. So designing in research integrity to our projects from the beginning to the end and from the planning stage to the end would certainly help in ensuring that we are engaging in good research conduct or practice as we go about the process. So research integrity is actually different to research ethics. Some of you may have experience engaging with the DCU Research Ethics Committee. The role of research ethics committees is basically to look at research proposals from the perspective of ethical guidelines to ensure that both researchers and participants are protected from harm. So it's quite a specific, focused field, so to speak. Research integrity, on the other hand, is a much broader range of activities and involves things that aren't necessarily looked at by by the RECs, the Research Ethics Committees that we have around. So here we're going to pause for a moment and resume the recording now. So effectively, we can see there's a slight difference between ethical issues and issues of integrity in research. So this series that we're starting today is going to be looking at integrity issues rather than ethics issues. So in that context, it can be useful to get a kind of a sense of, well, what's the difference between ethics and integrity using or looking at definitions. So here on the left, I have a brief definition of integrity, research integrity. On the right, I have a kind of a general definition of research ethics. So the question here is, where's the similarity or where's the difference? So ethical matters in research, basically because integrity matters usually can be addressed by looking at policies, codes, and guidelines, whereas ethical matters need to go a bit deeper and might need to seek advice from others. So let me just clear my screen of these annotations. So what constitutes research misbehavior, so to speak? Basically, the tendency nowadays is to consider research misbehavior or research misconduct on a spectrum. Life is not black and white. There are a lot of gray areas. And likewise, in research, there's a certain amount of gray area when we're talking about research conduct. So research misbehavior can be considered on a spectrum. So for example, failing to include a somewhat related publication in the background section of your paper would be an unacceptable research practice. So you've written a background section to your paper. There is a somewhat related publication that you haven't included in that background section. That could be considered an unacceptable research practice because maybe you ought to have included it because it's related, and maybe it's even a key source for your background. That's not the same as making up all the data that you report in your publication, which is a case of research misconduct. So you can see that there's a difference between not citing an important source and making up one's data, basically. Even within the irresponsible or unacceptable research practices, some might be more serious and require a formal investigation, whereas others might not be so serious and perhaps could be dealt with through an informal conversation between a supervisor and a student, or a mentor and a mentee. So hopefully we'll get a bit more clarity on this as we move on. So if we do want to sort of get a sense of how we can address unacceptable or irresponsible research practice, on the one hand, we have the misconduct policies, and on the other hand, we have the codes of good research conduct, basically. So the misconduct policies basically focus on the practices that should be avoided. Yeah? That can be called research misconduct. And these policies also usually focus on how you go about investigating or reporting a possible scenario of misconduct. But these policies do not usually contain much information about the lower level irresponsible research practices. On the other hand, the codes of good research conduct do often give a bit more information about different types of breaches that could occur within research. So the codes of good research conduct are sometimes more helpful in helping us to identify the scenarios that are less serious, so to speak, in terms of irresponsible research practice as compared to the major misconduct scenarios. So in Europe, and also the Irish National Code of Conduct for Research Integrity is based on this European code. So the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity is an important framework that is used across the continent to facilitate the self-regulation of research and that includes research across all sorts of different settings and disciplines. So in Europe, research misconduct is basically classified into fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism at any stage of the research, that is, proposing, performing, or reviewing the research, or in actually reporting the research results. If you go to Canada and the US, the understanding of research misconduct is slightly different. So as we are basically in the European context, it's worthwhile, keeping in mind that for us, research misconduct is related to fabrication, making up things, falsification, falsifying, or graying up perhaps some aspect of our research, or plagiarism, which is obviously not citing the sources. So these are the violations that are considered to be the most serious forms of research misconduct. Okay, so here we have another practical activity for you with fabrication. Okay, so those are the 3 most serious forms of research misconduct in the European context. Now, in the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, we are also given quite a number of examples of the lesser evil, so to speak, in research misconduct. Those scenarios that could be considered unacceptable practice in research or irresponsible research practices. So we have things such as allowing others, even funders, to jeopardize the impartiality of the research process, or misusing seniority to advance one's own career, misusing statistics or citing selectively or inaccurately, hiding the use of artificial intelligence in research publications. This is becoming a bigger issue now, as we know. There's more and more use of AI in research. And broadly speaking, the guidelines in the European context is that substantive use of AI in research needs to be declared in a transparent manner. So to hide the use of AI or to hide the substantive use of AI in research publications would definitely constitute an unacceptable practice. Other things could be withholding research data or results without justification, manipulating authorship in publications, which can also happen quite a bit, republishing your own publications without duly citing the original, as we mentioned, self-plagiarism, using journals, publishers, events, or services that undermine the quality of research. So here we're talking about predatory journals or conferences, paper mills. We'll have another session later on in the series on predatory journals. Misrepresenting research achievements, data involvement or interests, accusing a researcher of misconduct or other violations in a malicious way. So the European Code does give us quite a few examples of unacceptable research practices. Okay, so here we have another practical. Okay, I'm going to move on now and give you the feedback so you can compare and contrast what you had come up with. So in terms of feedback, what might be considered on the lower end of unacceptable research practices were the errors in analysis, inadequate record keeping, making mistakes when referencing sources. So these are at the lower end of the spectrum because they can also be simply the consequence of genuine human error and not necessarily deliberate or intentional. But getting to a more serious kind of situation, more in the middle of the spectrum, are things such as failing to mention the use of AI in the research or not registering clinical research. So why are these more serious? They're more serious because they're more likely to be intentional. I mean, if you used AI, you know you used it, and not mentioning it, you have to make a choice not to mention it. Likewise, you need to make a decision usually not to register a clinical trial or clinical research. The cases of the examples that were given that would constitute actual research misconduct were things like ignoring data points, failing to declare conflicts of interest, manipulating images, we've got there the fabrication, infringing copyright. So these are much more serious because they're often intentional and they have more serious consequences. So this is just to show there's a kind of a spectrum along which we can find different kinds of research malpractice. There's one that we didn't say on the feedback where it would fit, the one about publishing in journals that have no peer review, such as bogus journals. Where would we fit that on this spectrum? Publishing in journals that have no peer review. Is that unacceptable research practice or somewhere in the middle, or research misconduct? Yeah, probably a lot more likely to be here in the middle because it's intentional, isn't it? And as researchers, we do have the responsibility to find out about how genuine the journal in which we are hoping to publish actually is. So basically what we're seeing here is that as researchers, trying to work with integrity also involves learning how to distinguish genuine mistakes that were made by mistake in our research and can be avoided if possible and corrected if they occur, and distinguish them from the more serious kinds of misconduct issues that we've given some examples here. Okay, if you were to go to our Research Integrity online training program that's available on Loop, in Module 2, you'd find a very interesting screen, which I've just captured here, which basically helps you to avoid unacceptable research practice in your research. So for each of these circles, is my research question relevant? When you click on that, it would give you a series of questions you could ask yourself to ensure that your research is responsible. Likewise, am I using the best methodology? You'd click on that and you get another list of questions that would help you to think about your methodology from the perspective of research integrity. Then the whole issue of planning one's research, reporting and results, and the usability of our results. So afterwards, if you like, you can go and have a look at these different circles and see the variety of questions that are raised there precisely to help us to think about designing integrity into our research from the very beginning. So what kind of impact can irresponsible research practices have, or even research misconduct? So this is a case of plagiarism, which is pretty well known. It's not always easy to check and double check one's work to make sure that you've put in all the sources that you actually used in your research. But it's really important to do so because if you don't, there can be serious consequences. So we know that the former president of Harvard in 2023 came under fire, so to speak, because reports came out that in her dissertation and some of her early publications, there were long texts extracted from other sources without the proper citations. So one might think, oh, well, what kind of consequences might come if they discover later in my research life that I practiced plagiarism in my early publications or in my early work? Will that affect me once I'm an established researcher? So if you were to do this exercise on our research integrity course on Loop, you'd get different answers, options that you can choose as answers. So the 4 options that they give are that it could have a major impact on your career, that it could damage the reputation of your university, that there'd be no consequences because your subsequent research record would be so good that your earlier mistakes wouldn't matter. And you might have some professional embarrassment, but no significant impact on your career. So those are the 4 options that you're given, and you have to rate them basically in that particular exercise. So I think we're pretty clear on what the correct answers are here. Early career plagiarism can have a major impact on your career, no matter what stage you are at, and very particularly if you're at the more mature end of your career, you can end up being required or asked to resign, step down from leadership positions, which is precisely what happened to the president of Harvard. And there's also damage to your university, be it the university where you now are a leader or an important researcher, be it also the university you belong to, perhaps when you did your dissertation, or you belonged to when you carried out your first publications. So the backlash can come many years later. So it's important really to think about the impact that research misconduct can actually have. When we're talking about irresponsible research practices or unacceptable research practices, now this raises another matter that can sometimes be a bit tricky and a bit challenging, which is the issue of responsibility. One thing is our own possible, hopefully acceptable research practice, but we may be part of a research team and we may realize that other people in the team are engaging in unacceptable practices in their area of the research. This actually brings with it a responsibility to report that kind of behavior when we become aware of it. But of course, one needs to be wise, prudent. We need to know what to report and how to go about reporting it. So, I mean, the principle is that if you do become aware of misconduct or intentional unacceptable research practice, it should be reported. But at the same time, you don't know what the person you want to report is doing fully. Probably you don't have full knowledge of all the factors behind that behavior of your colleague. So this means that if you do have suspicions regarding research malpractice in a colleague, initially you should only share your concerns with the person at your institution who's responsible for reviewing misconduct allegations. Here at DCU, the Research Integrity Officer who's responsible for receiving misconduct allegations is Dr. Declan Rafferty. Yeah. However, sometimes even before going to that level, let's say, it can be good to seek support and advice about the concerns that you have at a lower level and in a more informal kind of a context. So, for example, in each of our faculties, we have a faculty research integrity advocate who you could contact and have an unofficial informal conversation with about your concerns. Or you could also contact myself and we could have an informal conversation. This gives you the chance to sort of have somebody else as a sounding board to check if what you think is misconduct or an unacceptable research practice actually is, and what would be the best next step. At the same time, you need to think about how you're going to report things, if you are going to report them. Okay, so maybe you've observed something that you consider to be irresponsible, but you need to be able to say why you think it was malpractice. You need to have evidence that the behavior happened and that it constitutes malpractice. You need to be clear about where should that irresponsible research be reported, depending again on how serious it is, where it stands on the spectrum we looked at earlier. And then think about the importance of maintaining confidentiality, because we can all make mistakes. Even though we have goodwill, we can make mistakes. Or we might just be annoyed with one of our colleagues, and that can lead us to look out maybe for things that don't actually constitute bad practice in their research, but which we might think we could make use of to make life more complicated for them, which would definitely not be a scenario of research integrity. Okay, so at this point, we're running out of time, so we don't have time to go into these small group discussions, but this would be something that it would be interesting to think about in terms of research. There are 4 different questions there. What sorts of behaviors would you consider to be examples of misconduct? And which examples of unacceptable research practices? This could be something that you do with some colleagues back in your faculty or in your school within your research discipline. Yeah, try to have a chat about, okay, in our discipline, what would constitute actual misconduct and what would be a more simple kind of unacceptable research practice? Because of course, within the different disciplines, there will be different scenarios. It's good to think about. Another thing that we can think about and talk about over lunch, what sort of further questions might you need to ask to determine whether a behavior is more or less serious? So again, that would depend on the behaviors that you're identifying. What other questions do you need to ask, to assess how serious it is or not? Third, are the impacts of misconduct always more serious than those of unacceptable research practices? That's another interesting question, because we've said that research misconduct of its very nature is more serious: fabrication, falsification, plagiarism. And they have consequences and impacts. But does that mean that the unacceptable research practices do not also have some kind of impact that could be quite serious? And we might realize that smaller things that are even the consequence of human error or that are more or less intentional can also have impact. We're talking now about declaring the use or not declaring the use of AI in our research. That could end up having impact, particularly because many publishers, as I was discussing with a colleague this morning, are now using a couple of different AI systems precisely to assess whether articles that have been presented for publication have or have not been prepared using AI. And in some cases, if the software finds that the potential publication has used AI and hasn't declared it, well, that might mean that you don't get published. And there might be other sort of serious consequences as well. And fourthly, how should an unacceptable research practice be handled as opposed to a case of misconduct? So again, this could be something interesting to discuss within a research team or within your school. Having identified examples of unacceptable research practice and examples of misconduct, well, how do we handle those different kinds of scenarios? A postgraduate student could think about how they would handle these kind of challenges if they came across them in their relations with their supervisors or if they're part of a broader research team. Or likewise, an experienced researcher could also think about how they could help their mentees or postgraduate students in supervision to really try to avoid any type of unacceptable research practice and have those frank conversations in order to help that younger researcher to develop an attitude and a practice that is inspired and motivated by genuine concern for research integrity. Okay, so at this point, we've come to the end of the session. I'll just stop the recording here.